I'm Tom Baker, this is Chasing Cars. Today we're testing the 2024 Mitsubishi ASX, one of the longest running vehicles on the Australian market. At 14 years old, the ASX has existed for 2 years longer than I've been reviewing cars, which feels like it's been happening for quite some time, particularly if you're a subscriber to the channel. So, what's going on with the ASX, and why do Australians keep buying it in droves? In fact, Mitsubishi has improved the ASX's market share in 2024. It's literally more successful this year than it was last year. So in today's video, we're going to try and figure out why that is. Because on virtually any objective metric, the ASX is worse than nearly any rival. And yet, there's something about this car's simplicity and also the implicit promise of durability that Mitsubishi gives buyers that appeals. So we're going to get to the bottom of that today. But before we get started, hit subscribe below. Chasing Cars, honest reviews of your next car. Brought to you by Budget Direct. Okay, diving into the interior of the ASX and out of the rain, we've had a very long, cold, wet winter in Australia this year, or at least in Sydney, a bit like the long life of the Mitsubishi ASX. Now, there are some vehicle segments where it's completely normal for a car to last pretty much forever. My mind goes to things like the 70 series Land Cruiser, for instance, but there's charm to that and there's purpose. In the small SUV segment, I don't think there's really much excuse for 14 years without substantial updates, but that is exactly what we get here in the ASX. Now, that might be okay if the price reflected the amortization of the product, meaning that Mitsubishi has made its money back and then some with this car, I strongly suspect. But that's not really the case, because the trim that we're sitting in today is the ASX ES with the street package, which gives you decals and blacked out bits around the body, which I'll show you later. But that brings the price above $32,000 drive away. Now in 2024, that is kind of one of the cheaper new cars out there, but within the segment, it's not a particular deal. Something like a base Kia Seltos, which is a much more modern, better driving, better equipped car, is actually cheaper drive away than this ASX ES. And then if you go to the lesser known Chinese brands, such as Haval, MG, I'd probably say MG's about as well known as Mitsubishi these days though, wouldn't you? They can all sell you cheaper vehicles than this. Now something like an MG ZS is not a great car, but the Haval Jolion probably better than the Mitsubishi ASX in several regards, and that's because Mitsubishi has allowed this vehicle to just languish. Now, should you care about that? Well, maybe not, because if you're after something really mechanically simple and without any of the bells and whistles, then you'll be right at home. Now, once you get into this cabin, you do feel like you're in an antique. It honestly does feel like going back to 2010 with a couple of updates, like this 8-inch touchscreen down here, which is kind of bare minimum. No wireless Apple CarPlay, no wireless Android Auto, but you do have those systems if you plug in via a USB-A port. Of course, no modern USB-C ports. Who needs fast charging anyway? No digital speedometer. You just look forward at what would have been just acceptable in 2010, but even then this car was not cutting edge. So 14 years later, it's really way, way behind the curve of this segment. And if you go and look at our Chasing Cars small SUV mega test for 2023, this car was not even invited because it didn't make the cut to be there, which I think tells you so much about the regard that we don't have for this vehicle as professional road testers, and yet it continues to sell in significant numbers. I think part of that is because the interior works exactly as you would expect. It may be exceptionally dated for the class and not even that cheap, but we've got great simple controls like big dials for the climate control in this car. You've got a volume dial, you've got a tuning dial, you've got a round leather steering wheel with easy stalks, simple shortcuts for things like the manual cruise control, big button for your trip computer here, you can't miss that, easy controls for the windows, just simple manual seats. They're not particularly comfortable. After about an hour of road testing, my back started to ache from the lack of support and no lumbar. But as a short distance runabout, as a really simple vehicle you don't have to think about or particularly care about, the ASX does have a little bit of, I guess, kind of rugged appeal to it. But quality on this particular tester isn't that great, and there's no excuse for that 14 years into the production run. Everything should be perfect by now. And yet, in this brand new tester, with just 4,155 kilometers on the clock, the entire instrument binnacle is rattling as you proceed down a road that has any imperfections in it. That is simply not good enough with a product with this much age on it. In terms of storage, we do have big cup holders down here. We've got a decent sized bottle holder in the door. We've got a tray between the seats with a 12-volt socket. It's reasonably deep. And we have a good sized glove box as well. Some of the materials do have some yielding softness to them. Most of them don't. I suspect that doesn't matter to people that want to buy this car. Okay, I know that was probably quite a lot to take in and a little bit pessimistic and negative, but at Chasing Cars, we do independent, honest car reviews, so I'm just telling you how it is from my opinion. Shifting to the back seat, however, we do gain a couple of points back because firstly, the ASX joins the unusual group of vehicles that has, I would say, a more comfortable back seat than front seat. We actually have decent thigh support, we actually have decent lumbar in the back here, so I don't think you could drive it from the back, unfortunately, but those seated back here will be just fine. As a 6 foot, 183 centimeters, headroom is good, legroom is good, and tow room is also very generous, even with the driver's seat on the deck. In terms of amenities back here, a little bit lacking. We do have a flip down armrest, which is good and unexpected. We don't have air vents at all. So on a hot day, you'll need to get those up front to crank the AC in order to make things happen back here. Naturally, as you'd expect for this segment, hard door plastics, although a soft little armrest down here isn't too bad. You will get a third person in the back if you have to. More comfortable just with people in the outboard seats, I would suggest. Moving around the back of the ASX now, a word on the styling. I probably would have said a few years ago that the ASX was one of the more handsome vehicles in the segment, and frankly, it continues to be inoffensive. But I think now that we're all so used to seeing this vehicle on the road for such a long time, basically half my life, I think you can't avoid the conclusion that it's just very dated, both inside and out. But if you're not someone that needs to keep up with the latest design trends, then that probably won't matter to you. Now, this one being the ES Street Edition, you do get some decals, some sticker packs on the side, things like black wheels, door handles, spoiler, and a little street badge on the back. So that's how you know where to drive it. Now, we do have a manual tailgate here, nothing too fancy. That opens up, nothing to write home about, but perfectly average. Now, it's a big square space. You'll get a couple of suitcases back there, no issue. You do actually have a relatively sturdy cargo blind. We've got our camera gear in here. That's worked out fine. Beneath the boot floor, there is a space saver spare, and then it's just a lift. Most people will be able to close that absolutely fine, which means we can move on to the running costs, which are pretty important actually when it comes to this car. When it comes to running costs, the ASX's mediocrity continues. It has a pretty underpowered engine, as we'll find when we take it for a drive, with the consequence being that you have to work that engine pretty hard to get up to speed. The result? High fuel consumption. On my combined testing loop, the ASX returned just under 10 litres per 100 kilometres, which is a lot for such a small and relatively light two-wheel drive vehicle. Certainly far more fuel use than what you'd get in a corresponding hatchback or a more modern turbocharged small SUV, or of course, a hybrid like what Toyota would be able to sell you. On the highway though, this will settle down to the mid sevens and you can use the cheapest 91 octane petrol in this vehicle. Now, I want to talk about warranty because I think this is a big reason why ordinary Australians are attracted to the ASX. Mitsubishi splashes their 10-year warranty across all of their marketing, albeit with a little asterisk, which most people probably won't bother to read the fine print. Well, the fine print is actually pretty important because the ASX's headline 10-year, 200,000 kilometre warranty only applies if you stick to servicing this vehicle through Mitsubishi dealers, which gets pretty costly out towards that 10-year mark. In fact, the 10-year cap price servicing total is about $5,000 for this car, although the first 5 years are cheaper. If you don't stick to servicing within Mitsubishi's network, well, you only get a warranty of 5 years, 100,000 kilometers, which is worse than just about any rival, which will give you unlimited kilometers on a 5-year warranty. So that's why the fine print does sometimes matter. Okay, so let's take the ASX for a drive, which starts with a key. Don't get to test too many cars like that anymore. That's all right though. Okay, slotting our CVT automatic into drive. So, pulling out, I've been driving the ASX for the last few days in a mix of environments, commuting, fair bit of work in town, but also some highway and country road stuff too. So I feel like I'm pretty well reacquainted with the ASX now. This is definitely not the first ASX I've road tested. You can find my earlier ASX reviews on the Chasing Cars channel, but in the meantime, mechanically, there's been really no change to this car. Mitsubishi have really only fiddled with the range lineup in that time. Things like the powertrain and drivetrain. You used to be able to get a diesel ASX, you used to be able to get all-wheel drive, all that stuff's gone now. It's simpler in that sense. 2 petrol engines, a 2-litre, which we've got here, and a 2.4-litre. Neither of them are turbocharged. And your transmission choice is a CVT auto on almost every single variant, as we've got here, although the base car can actually be had with a 5-speed manual, which is probably what I would do if I was locked into buying an ASX. I'd just go base manual, keep it as cheap and simple as possible. Now this one is the ES with the street pack, which really is just a sticker pack. So for all intents and purposes, it's an ES with the 2-litre petrol engine and the CVT automatic transmission. And it's fine in the sense that it has motive power. It goes where you want it to go. It's not difficult to drive. It's quite easy to drive this car. But the overwhelming sensation dynamically from this vehicle is it has no finesse. It has very little refinement. It is a seriously coarse vehicle in this day and age. Even back in 2010, when the ASX would have been competing in a way with sort of the Volkswagen Golf of its time. Obviously that's a hatchback, this is a small SUV, I get that. You know, this car would have felt dated then, but fast forward 15 years, the small SUV segment has grown from just a few cars to over 20 vehicles here in Australia, and almost all of this car's rivals offer significantly more finesse and sophistication and refinement, plus generally other things as well, like more power or a hybrid system for better fuel economy, or just more sophisticated ride and handling. In all of those areas, the ASX is well and truly behind. So starting with the powertrain, 2-litre non-turbo petrol 4-cylinder, there's still quite a few of these engines in the segment, but they're not the most high end. So here we have 110 kilowatts of power and 197 newton meters of torque, which actually aren't bad outputs. It's just that without the aid of a turbocharger, you do have to rev out the ASX in order to get up to speed, which in turn increases your fuel economy and the din in the cabin in terms of engine noise. But you know what? I actually don't hate the 2-litre and CVT as much as some, because it's a fairly effective combination, particularly when the car is lightly loaded. Plus, some of the variants actually step up to a 2.4-litre, which is not as powerful as you'd expect. It's got a bit more power than this car, but not a heap more, and so that's even more adequate in terms of its performance. Engine and CVT are actually not the ASX's biggest weak points. The weak points dynamically are things like the steering, the ride quality, and the sound insulation in the cabin. This car always reminds you that it's cheap, that it's unsophisticated, and it just doesn't strive to be anything more, which these days actually stands out when you've got vehicles like the Toyota Yaris Cross and the Corolla Cross, which actually do try to be a little bit more than just the bare minimum in terms of dynamic capability. This car always reminds you that it's cheap and unrefined and unsophisticated, from the coarse and revvy engine to the way it crashes through bumps to the really poor steering tuning, which boggles the mind that Mitsubishi haven't gotten around to fixing it in the last decade and a half. I mean, what have they been doing with this car? Probably just counting their money, because being fully amortized as a product like the ASX should well be by this point, it would be a profit printing machine for Mitsubishi. But sadly, unlike most manufacturers, they haven't really turned any attention to improving the product mechanically over that time, and I think that's sad. Now, it used to be, including when the ASX came out, that brands like Toyota were also rolling the arm in terms of dynamics. The cars were reliable, mechanically simple, durable, but not very good to drive, a bit like the ASX still is. The difference being that Toyota has completely transformed its approach to how its vehicles drive in the meantime. They're still mechanically durable, they're still reliable, but they actually ride well, they steer well. There's a bit of sophistication and a bit of finesse to the chassis, and Mitsubishi just hasn't bothered with any of that. You know, you drive more modern Mitsubishis like the current generation Outlander, and it is better. So I think the brand is capable of improving. I just don't think it really wants to when it comes to the ASX. Now, as we rev our way up a slight hill, there's all sorts of talk of a new generation ASX, and Mitsubishi Australia has been trying to work out what it's going to do in terms of replacing this car in our market. In Europe, there is a Renault-based vehicle, which is one of the contenders. There's also a Southeast Asian market new-gen small SUV for Mitsubishi, but there's concerns that that vehicle would meet Australia's safety regulations. So we don't know what the answer is going to be. I suspect it'll be the European car, which would of course be a leap forward in how this car drives, but we'd have to wait until we tested that vehicle to see just how much of an improvement it really would be. For now, we continue to drive the current gen car. The problem dynamically really relates to things like the damping. So the suspension's quite crashy, even though we've got small wheels and relatively decent profile tires. Almost every bump can be felt through an initial pitter-patter from the front suspension, and then just this under-damped rear suspension which bobs and crashes into a bump and gives you a nice boom through the cabin as you come out of it. So in terms of damping, it's really just not there. And on an extended test drive where you drive in your area and you hit the bumps that you know, you'll wonder why this car can't soak up the bumps a little bit better. In terms of the steering front, we don't have properly tuned steering in this car, so the rack is quite slow, so you add effort, you add more turn in order to get the car to go where you want, and then weak body control comes into play. Suddenly you do actually get a steering response, and the front end sort of heaves across, almost as if it's a body on frame vehicle like a dual cab, like, you know, Triton or a Pajero Sport, something like that. But no, this is a monocoque unibody vehicle that's relatively small, relatively light. We should expect more of a taut response from a car like this, which is what you'd get from most of its rivals. So what I want you to take away from my dynamic commentary about the car is that even though the ASX is kind of unsophisticated and simple, it's not in a good way. There are certain cars in the market which are just simple to drive, not particularly special, but they're competent at things like ride and handling. And something like the Toyota Corolla Cross would be a good example of that. You're never going to really remember it to drive, but it's perfectly fine. The ASX isn't perfectly fine. It's now an arm rolling exercise for Mitsubishi, which is a real shame. It doesn't ride well enough, it doesn't steer well enough, it doesn't go well enough. So while, you know, it's a car, it does car things, it will drive you around, virtually any rival in this segment will do that better. So frankly, when I think about the way the ASX is priced, just over 30 grand as tested, for me, it would need to be priced around 19,990 to be worthy of consideration given its demerits. Now, if you think I'm being a little bit over harsh, well, you're obviously entitled to that opinion, but I do test everything in this segment and I can tell you what is and what is no longer meeting the standard, and the ASX is part of the latter group. Now, I will give you a word about safety, however, because Mitsubishi has added a few features to this car over time in terms of safety, particularly to retain some fleet sales. So we do have AEB, lane departure warning, forward collision warning, systems like that. However, what I'll tell you about the lane departure warning, for instance, is it's virtually missing in action. So it will trigger sometimes, but you don't really feel its effect. So these features may as well just not be here. I haven't tested the AEB, thankfully. We do have a reversing camera, however. The canvas on the 8-inch screen is pretty large, so that's not too bad. So what's my final verdict on the Mitsubishi ASX? Well, I'm going to tell you, but I'll preface it by saying that this is definitely one of the vehicles on the market where there is a massive disconnect between professional road testers, at least the ones that tell the truth, and what the Australian buying public thinks. The ASX continues to sell in droves, and I'm a big believer that when thousands and thousands of people are purchasing a product, then it must be doing something right. And Mitsubishi is certainly doing something right when it comes to marketing the ASX. This car comes across as very durable, reliable, mechanically simple, and easy to service because you'll find a dealer. Mitsubishi's network is vast in Australia, and I think that makes people feel safe, particularly when you see an ASX on every street corner. There's safety in numbers. Compare that to my professional opinion, which is that this car is a serious underperformer. It is so dated. It's not even that cheap. There are some competitors which are cheaper and significantly better than this car. It's slow, it uses a lot of fuel, it handles badly, it's uncomfortable to ride in, and it's so lacking in features compared to the newest cars in the segment that to buy a new one of these in 2024 would require very, very careful consideration of whether this car will still be doing what you want in a few years' time. But clearly, for a lot of people, the answer to that question is that it will be doing what they need now and into the future, if that is just a very, very simple, easy to understand runabout. And you know what? That's okay. If it was me and I wanted something with Japanese reliability, I'd be getting in the queue for a Toyota Yaris Cross or Corolla Cross hybrid. If I wanted something with a long warranty, I'd probably purchase a Kia Seltos or a Skoda Kamiq, all vehicles that can be had for around the same price as this car. That's my opinion. Please let me know your opinion down below in the comments. While you're there, hit subscribe and the notification bell. And as always, thank you for watching Chasing Cars.